There is something very strange about attention. The more desperately you want it, the less of it you seem to receive. And the more comfortable you will become without it, the more people begin to notice you. You see this everywhere. Someone walks into a room and immediately wants everyone to know they're there. They talk too much. They explain themselves. They tell people what they're doing, where they're going, who they know, what they've accomplished. They constantly check whether people are responding to them. And underneath all of that is usually one simple desire: see me, notice me, tell me that I matter. And the strange thing is, people can feel that need. You don't have to say it. You can hide it behind confidence. You can hide it behind jokes. You can hide it behind success. But people sense when you're asking them to validate you. And once they sense that you're hungry for their attention, something changes. You become easier to predict, easier to manipulate, and in many cases, less interesting, because mystery begins where explanation ends. Think about the people you're genuinely fascinated by. Usually, they aren't the people who tell you everything about themselves in the first 5 minutes. They're the people where you think, there's something about this person I don't completely understand. You don't know exactly what they're thinking. You don't know everything they're working on. You don't know why they're so calm. You don't know why they don't seem desperate to be liked. And that uncertainty creates curiosity. Human beings are naturally drawn toward things they haven't completely figured out. But there's something deeper going on here. When you constantly seek attention, you're actually giving other people control over your emotional state. If they respond to your message, you feel important. If they don't respond, you feel rejected. If they compliment you, you feel confident. If they criticize you, your confidence disappears. If someone watches your story, you feel noticed. If they don't, you start wondering what happened. So now your emotional life is being controlled by people who may not even be thinking about you. That's a very expensive price to pay for attention. And this is where you have to become honest with yourself. Are you actually looking for connection, or are you looking for confirmation that you're valuable? Because those are two completely different things. Connection comes from being interested in another person. Validation comes from needing another person to tell you who you are. And the second one can become an addiction. You post something, you wait, you check, you refresh, you look at who viewed it, you wonder why someone didn't respond, you send another message, you make yourself available immediately. You start explaining why you didn't get a response, and eventually, without realizing it, you're no longer living your life. You're managing other people's perception of you. That's when you become cheap. Not because you are actually worth less, but because you're constantly giving your attention, your time, your emotional energy, and your availability away without requiring anything in return. And anything that is endlessly available begins to lose its perceived value. Look at nature. There are things we value precisely because they are not everywhere. Rare things attract attention. Scarce things create desire. Distance creates imagination. And mystery gives the mind something to work with. But this doesn't mean you should start playing childish games. It doesn't mean you should deliberately ignore people. It doesn't mean you should pretend you're busy when you're not. It doesn't mean you should manipulate someone by disappearing for 3 days. That's not mystery. That's insecurity wearing a costume. Real mystery comes from having a life that doesn't revolve around being observed. You don't have to disappear. You simply don't need to announce everything. You don't need everyone to know what you're building. You don't need to explain every decision. You don't need to prove that you're happy. You don't need to tell people that you're becoming successful. You don't need to constantly demonstrate your worth. You let your life speak. And this is one of the most powerful forms of confidence, because when you know where you're going, you don't need to keep looking around to see who's watching. Think about someone who is deeply absorbed in their craft. A writer writing, an artist creating, an athlete training, a business owner building, a scientist researching, someone who genuinely cares about what they're doing. They're not constantly thinking, are people impressed? They're thinking, is this good? Am I improving? Have I understood this? Can I go deeper? That's a completely different psychological state. their attention has moved away from themselves. And ironically, that's often when other people begin paying attention to them, because there is something magnetic about a person who isn't constantly trying to be magnetic. They're absorbed, they're present. They're unavailable to trivial things, and that gives them weight. One of the biggest mistakes people make is confusing visibility with importance. They think, if people don't see me, I don't matter. But that's backwards. Your value doesn't increase because more people are watching you. Your value increases because you are becoming someone worth watching. And those are very different things. You can have thousands of people watching you while having nothing meaningful happening inside your life. And you can spend months working quietly on something that eventually changes everything. The second person may look invisible for a long time, but invisibility is not the same thing as insignificance. Sometimes invisibility is where transformation happens. You need periods of your life where nobody knows what you're doing, not because you're hiding, but because you're building. There's a certain power in being able to say, I don't need to show this yet. I don't need everyone to understand. I don't need applause. I don't need permission. I'm going to keep going. That is difficult in a world that encourages you to broadcast your entire existence. Every meal, every achievement, every opinion, every relationship, every emotion, every trip, every success, every problem. We have created a world where privacy can feel like failure. And that's dangerous, because if everything has to be displayed, you eventually start living for the display. You don't experience the moment. You experience yourself experiencing the moment. You're at dinner, but you're thinking about the photograph. You're traveling, but you're thinking about the post. You're working, but you're thinking about how successful you'll look when you're finished. You're in a relationship, but you're thinking about how the relationship appears to other people. And slowly, the audience becomes more important than the experience. That's how you lose yourself. So one of the most powerful things you can do is reclaim your attention. Stop giving it away so easily. Not everyone deserves access to your thoughts. Not everyone deserves immediate responses. Not everyone deserves an explanation. Not everyone needs to know your next move. And not every silence needs to be filled. This last one is especially important. People are uncomfortable with silence. They feel like they have to say something. They have to respond. They have to explain. They have to defend. They have to keep the conversation alive. But silence can reveal a tremendous amount. When you stop filling every empty space, you start noticing what other people do. Who reaches out? Who asks questions? Who becomes uncomfortable? Who only contacts you when they need something? Who respects your space? Who becomes more interested when you stop chasing them? Silence becomes a filter. And sometimes the people who disappear when you stop pursuing them were never really connected to you. They were connected to your attention. There's another important distinction here. Being mysterious doesn't mean being emotionally unavailable. You can be warm. You can be kind. You can love people deeply. You can express affection. You can tell someone what you feel, but you don't have to beg them to reciprocate. That's where self-respect enters. You give because you want to give. You love because you want to love. You help because it reflects who you are. But you don't turn those things into transactions. You don't say, I did this for you, so now you owe me attention. You don't say, I was always there for you, so why aren't you choosing me? You don't chase someone simply because they pulled away. You recognize something very difficult. Sometimes rejection is information. Sometimes someone's lack of interest is an answer. Sometimes their silence tells you more than their words ever could. And your job isn't to convince them. Your job is to understand what their behavior is telling you. Because the moment you start begging someone to recognize your value, you've already forgotten your own. And that's the deepest problem with attention seeking. It doesn't begin with other people. It begins inside. There's an emptiness, a doubt, a fear that maybe you're not enough. And you try to fill that feeling with external evidence, likes, messages, compliments, followers, money, status, romantic attention. But external attention can never permanently solve an internal uncertainty, because the moment the attention disappears, the insecurity comes back. So you need more, and then more, and then more. It's like trying to fill a hole with water. For a moment, it looks full, then it's empty again. The alternative is much harder. You build something inside yourself that doesn't collapse when the audience disappears. You develop skills. You develop discipline. You develop taste. You develop knowledge. You develop character. You develop a relationship with your own mind. You become comfortable spending time alone. You learn what you actually like. You learn what you actually believe. You discover what you want to accomplish when nobody is watching. And eventually something changes. You stop asking, how do I get people to notice me? And you start asking, what am I becoming? That is a much more powerful question, because when you become genuinely interesting to yourself, you no longer need to constantly perform for other people. You become selective. You listen more. You speak when you have something worth saying. You stop explaining things that don't require explanation. You stop announcing plans before you've done the work. You stop chasing people who have already shown you that they don't want to walk beside you. And you stop confusing attention with respect. Attention can be bought. Attention can be manipulated. Attention can be manufactured. Respect is different. Respect comes from consistency, from boundaries, from competence too, from self-control, from being able to walk away, and perhaps most importantly, from not needing to be chosen by everyone. There is something incredibly powerful about a person who can say, I would like you in my life, but I don't need you to define my life. That changes everything, because now you're not approaching people from desperation. You're approaching them from choice. You're not saying, please choose me. You're saying, let's see if we are right for each other. That's a completely different position, and it applies to relationships, friendships, business, work, social situations, everything. The person who desperately needs approval has very little freedom. The person who can tolerate being misunderstood has much more. And that's why you shouldn't be afraid of being misunderstood. People are going to create stories about you anyway. If you're quiet, they'll call you arrogant. If you're confident, they'll call you selfish. If you're ambitious, they'll call you obsessed. If you set boundaries, they'll say you've changed. If you stop chasing them, they'll say you don't care. You cannot control every interpretation. So why build your life around controlling people's opinions? Let them think. Let them wonder. Let them misunderstand. Your responsibility is not to manage every person's perception of you. Your responsibility is to know who you are. And there's another paradox here. The less you try to appear powerful, the more powerful you can become. Real power doesn't constantly announce itself. It doesn't need to. A person who has nothing to prove doesn't need to prove that they have nothing to prove. They simply move differently. They don't rush to respond to every provocation. They don't fight every criticism. They don't correct every misunderstanding. They don't reveal every emotion. They don't need the last word. They understand that attention is a resource, and they spend it carefully. So ask yourself today, where am I begging for attention? Who am I constantly trying to impress? Whose approval changes my mood? Who am I chasing? What am I explaining that doesn't need to be explained? What am I revealing simply because I want someone to notice me? And perhaps the hardest question, if nobody could see what I was doing, would I still want to do it? Because the answer to that question can tell you a lot about your life. If you would still build it when nobody is watching, you're probably building something real. If you would stop the moment nobody applauded, maybe you were building for the audience. And there's nothing wrong with wanting recognition. We're human. We all want to be seen. We all want to be appreciated. We all want someone to say, I see what you've done, but you cannot make that your source of identity. Let attention be a bonus. Let recognition be a consequence. Let respect be earned, but let your purpose exist independently of the audience. Because the strongest person in the room isn't necessarily the loudest. It may be the person who is perfectly comfortable not being noticed. The person who can enter quietly, observe, listen, think, and leave without needing anyone to ask where they went. That's mystery. That's self-control. And ultimately, that's freedom. You don't become powerful by making everyone look at you. You become powerful when you no longer need them to. And once you stop begging for attention, something very interesting happens. You finally have enough attention left over to build a life worth noticing. There is another side to this that most people don't understand. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do with another person is absolutely nothing. Not because you're trying to punish them, not because you're trying to make them jealous, not because you're playing some psychological game, but because you finally realize that you don't have to react to everything. Someone doesn't text you back. You don't send another message. Someone misunderstands you. You don't immediately write a paragraph explaining yourself. Someone criticizes you. You don't rush to defend your character. Someone walks away. You don't run after them. This is difficult because your ego wants resolution. It wants the last word. It wants people to understand you. It wants people to know that you were right. But there is a hidden weakness in constantly needing to be understood. You're giving other people the responsibility of confirming your reality, and sometimes you have to be willing to let people misunderstand you. That's one of the hardest forms of emotional strength, because when you're secure in yourself, you don't need to correct every false story. You know what happened. You know what you intended. You know who you are. And if someone chooses to believe something different, you can live with that. This is where mystery becomes much deeper than simply saying less. Mystery is not silence. Mystery is depth. A shallow person has to constantly reveal himself because there isn't much beneath the surface. A deep person can remain quiet because there is an entire world happening inside. They're reading, they're thinking, they're observing, they're working, they're questioning themselves, they're developing ideas, they're experiencing things that don't need to become public immediately. That's why some people have a presence even when they aren't speaking. You feel that there is something there. And that is very different from someone who is desperately trying to create an impression. The person trying to create an impression is asking, how do I look? The mysterious person is asking, what am I learning? What am I noticing? What am I becoming? One is focused on appearance. The other is focused on substance, and eventually substance creates presence. This is why you should be careful about telling everyone your plans. There is a strange psychological reward that comes from announcing what you're going to do. You tell people, I'm going to start a business. I'm going to get in shape. I'm writing a book. I'm going to leave my job. I'm going to change my life. And for a moment, you feel like you've already accomplished something. People congratulate you. They tell you how exciting it is. You receive a little bit of the emotional reward before you've done the difficult work, and sometimes that is enough to reduce your hunger. You got the applause before the achievement, so there is something powerful about keeping certain ambitions private. Not everything needs to become a declaration. Sometimes you should disappear into the work. Don't announce the transformation. Become the transformation. Let people notice later. That is much more powerful because when someone sees the finished result without seeing all the struggle behind it, there's an element of mystery. They think, when did this happen? How did they become this person? And the answer is usually simple. They were working while everyone else was watching. There is another reason you should protect your privacy. The moment everyone knows what you're doing, everyone gets an opportunity to have an opinion about it. And opinions are dangerous when you're still building. One person says, that's a terrible idea. Another says, you should do it this way. Another says, why would you leave your job? Another says, that's not realistic. And suddenly you're carrying 10 different people's voices inside your head. You were building something that belonged to you. Now you're building something that has to survive everybody else's expectations. So sometimes silence protects creativity. It protects ambition. It protects your identity. It gives an idea enough time to become strong before you expose it to the world. And this applies to relationships too. You don't have to tell someone everything about you immediately. Let them discover you. Let them see different sides of you over time. There is something beautiful about gradually discovering another human being. The first conversation doesn't need to contain your entire history. The first month doesn't need to contain your entire emotional biography. You don't need to explain every wound. You don't need to reveal every insecurity. You don't need to tell them every relationship you've ever had. You don't need to prove how deeply you care. Let the relationship breathe. Because attraction often grows through discovery. If there is nothing left to discover, curiosity disappears. And curiosity is one of the forces that keeps people emotionally engaged. But again, there is a line. You should never manufacture mystery. Don't lie. Don't create fake secrets. Don't intentionally disappear. Don't pretend you don't care when you do. Don't use delayed responses as a weapon. That's not power. That's manipulation. Real mystery doesn't require deception. It comes naturally from having boundaries. You don't reveal something because you don't feel like revealing it. You don't answer a question because it's too personal. You don't share something because it's private. You don't give everyone access to every part of you. And you don't apologize for that. There is a difference between being secretive and being private. A secret is something you're afraid someone will discover. Privacy is something you consciously choose to protect. That distinction matters because once you understand privacy, you stop feeling guilty for having an inner world. And your inner world is yours, not your followers, not your friends, not your coworkers, not even your partner's entire property. A healthy relationship involves intimacy, but intimacy is not the destruction of individuality. You can love someone deeply and still have parts of yourself that belong to you, your thoughts, your interests, your ambitions, your quiet moments, your friendships, your relationship with yourself. That space is important because if you completely dissolve yourself into another person, eventually you become dependent on them for your identity, and then you start begging. Not necessarily with words. Sometimes begging looks like constantly asking, "Are you okay with me? Do you still love me? Why didn't you respond? Did I do something wrong? Are you upset? Do you still want me?" And occasionally, of course, these questions are normal, but when they become the foundation of your emotional life, you've created a prison. You're constantly monitoring someone else's emotional temperature, and that's exhausting. The stronger position is not to become cold, it's to become internally stable. You can care without panicking. You can love without clinging. You can miss someone without chasing them. You can want someone without needing them. That's emotional power. And there is a very important difference between wanting and needing. Wanting says, "I would love for you to be part of my life." Needing says, "My life has no meaning without you." A wanting gives you choice. Needing gives the other person control. And once someone knows you cannot walk away, they have enormous psychological leverage over you. That's why you need to develop a life that you genuinely value outside of any one person: your work, your friendships, your health, your interests, your goals, your solitude, your curiosity, your purpose. These things don't just make you more attractive, they make you harder to destroy. Because if one relationship ends, you still exist. If one person rejects you, you still have somewhere to go. If someone doesn't recognize your value, you don't collapse. You continue. That's what makes a person powerful, not the ability to make everyone want them. The ability to remain whole when someone doesn't. And this is where people often misunderstand confidence. They think confidence means walking into a room and dominating it, talking loudly, making jokes, being the center of attention, showing everyone how successful you are. But sometimes confidence looks like sitting quietly, listening, not competing, not interrupting, not trying to prove you're the smartest person in the room. You don't need to win every conversation. You don't need to demonstrate intelligence every 5 minutes. You don't need to turn every discussion into a performance. In fact, one of the strongest social skills is the ability to make other people feel interesting. Ask a question. Listen, let them talk. Pay attention to what they're saying, and don't immediately turn their story back toward yourself, because attention is powerful. And the person who can give genuine attention without desperately needing it returned has a certain kind of presence. They're not begging to be seen, they're seeing others. That's rare, and rare things become valuable. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. Sometimes you think you're giving too much because you're a generous person, but sometimes you're giving too much because you're afraid of losing someone. Those are not the same thing. Generosity comes from abundance. Overgiving often comes from fear. You buy the gifts, you make all the plans, you initiate every conversation, you forgive everything, you accept behavior you don't respect, you keep making excuses. And you tell yourself, I'm just being understanding, maybe. Or maybe you're terrified that if you stop giving, they will stop staying. And if that's the case, you need to pay attention, because love that requires you to constantly abandon yourself is not healthy love. Respect has to include self-respect. And self-respect sometimes means saying no. It means saying, that doesn't work for me. It means walking away from situations that repeatedly diminish you. It means not negotiating against yourself. And this is where people often become afraid. They think, if I set boundaries, people might leave. Yes, some people might. But that's information. The purpose of a boundary isn't to keep everyone, it's to reveal who respects you. A boundary is a filter, and the people who only liked you when you had no boundaries were not necessarily respecting you. They were benefiting from your lack of boundaries. That's a difficult truth, but it's an important one. You don't need to become harder. You need to become clearer, clear about what you accept, clear about what you don't, clear about where you're going, clear about who you are. And once you become clear, you don't need to constantly explain yourself. Your actions become consistent, your words become fewer, your standards become visible, and people learn how to interact with you. This is why consistency is more powerful than intensity. Anyone can be intense for a week. Anyone can send 50 messages. Anyone can make huge promises. Anyone can talk about how much they care. But what happens 6 months later, that's where character appears. Power isn't about creating a dramatic impression. It's about creating a pattern. You show up, you do what you said, you keep your word, you don't react emotionally to every little thing. You don't become a completely different person depending on who you're around. You remain yourself, and that stability creates trust. There's another form of cheapness that people rarely talk about. It's emotional cheapness. And emotional cheapness is when you give access to your deepest emotions to people who haven't earned that access. You meet someone, you barely know them, and suddenly you're telling them everything, your trauma, your fears, your deepest insecurities, your relationship history, your personal problems. And you think we connected, maybe, or maybe you simply revealed yourself too quickly. Real intimacy takes time. It is built through consistency, through observation, through shared experiences, through trust. You don't have to pour your entire emotional world onto someone just because they listened for an hour. Let people earn access, not because you're trying to control them, because your inner world has value and valuable things deserve protection. Think about your home. You don't open the front door and invite every stranger inside. That doesn't mean you're antisocial. It means you understand boundaries. Your mind deserves the same protection. Your emotions deserve the same protection. Your attention deserves the same protection. And your time is perhaps the most valuable of all, because you can make more money, you can buy more things, you can recover from mistakes, but you cannot recover yesterday. So be careful who receives your time. Be careful what receives your attention. Be careful what consumes your mind, because whatever repeatedly receives your attention eventually becomes part of your life. If you give your attention to gossip, gossip becomes your world. If you give your attention to outrage, outrage becomes your emotional state. If you give your attention to other people's lives, you stop building your own. But if you give your attention to your craft, your relationships, your health, your ideas, your purpose, something different happens. Your life begins to grow. And then you don't have to chase attention. Attention starts finding you, not because you're begging for it, because you've become interesting, you've developed something, you've built something, you've learned, you've become someone. That's the real secret. Don't spend your life trying to look valuable. Become valuable. Don't spend your life trying to look mysterious. Have a life deep enough that people cannot understand all of it immediately. Don't spend your life trying to look powerful. Develop enough self-control that you don't need to demonstrate power. Don't spend your life trying to make everyone want you. Become someone who can genuinely say, I want to be wanted, but I don't need to be. That sentence contains enormous freedom, because once you stop needing everyone to choose you, you become capable of choosing. You can choose your friends. You can choose your relationships. You can choose your work. You can choose your environment. You can choose what deserves your attention. You can choose what deserves your energy, and you can choose what you walk away from. That's the part people forget. Power isn't only the ability to attract, power is also the ability to refuse, to say, not for me, not anymore. I don't want this. I'm going somewhere else. And then actually leave. No dramatic speech, no revenge, no final paragraph, no attempt to make them regret it, just movement. Because sometimes the strongest message is the absence of a message. You simply stop participating and you continue building your life. Maybe they'll notice, maybe they won't. And eventually that won't matter to you, because that is the final stage. You stop doing things so that people will notice you. You stop becoming successful so someone will regret losing you. You stop getting in shape so an ex will see you. You stop making money so people will respect you. You stop improving yourself so people will say, wow, look what they became. You do it because you have become interested in your own potential. That's when the game changes. You're no longer performing. You're living. You're no longer chasing an audience. You're building a life. You're no longer asking, do they like me? You're asking, do I like who I'm becoming? And that question is infinitely more important, because at the end of your life, the people who watched you won't have to live with the consequences of your choices. You will. So stop handing the steering wheel to people who are only watching from the passenger seat. Take it back. Protect your attention. Protect your time. Protect your mystery. Protect your standards. Protect your inner world. And most importantly, protect your ability to walk away, because the moment you realize you can survive without someone's attention, their attention stops controlling you. And ironically, that is often the moment you become far more worthy of it. Not because you learned how to manipulate people, but because you finally learned how to stop manipulating yourself. You don't need to be everywhere. You don't need to be seen by everyone. You don't need to explain everything. You don't need to prove everything. You don't need to chase everyone. Build quietly. Speak carefully. Love deeply. Observe more than you reveal. Give without begging. Leave without revenge. And let people discover over time that there was always much more to you than what you showed them. Because mystery isn't about hiding who you are. It's about refusing to reduce yourself to what other people can immediately understand. And power isn't about making people afraid to lose you. It's about becoming so grounded in yourself that you are no longer afraid of being lost. That's when you stop being cheap. That's when you stop begging. That's when your presence starts carrying weight. And that's when you finally understand something most people spend their entire lives trying to learn. You don't become valuable by demanding attention. You become valuable by becoming someone whose attention is valuable.